November 15, 1944. The morning air over Tokyo hung thick with industrial haze, a grey blanket that had become as familiar to the city's 12 million residents as the sound of factory whistles and the sight of military uniforms on every street corner. In a windowless conference room deep within the Imperial General Headquarters compound, 7 men sat around a mahogany table that had witnessed 2 years of confident proclamations about the Empire's inevitable triumph. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff, studied a reconnaissance photograph with the careful attention of a man who had built his career on never showing surprise. The photograph showed an airfield, not just any airfield, but one carved from jungle and coral on an island called Saipan, more than 2,300 kilometers from where these men now sat. The runway stretched nearly 3 kilometers long, a ribbon of crushed coral and asphalt that represented something the Japanese High Command had been assured was impossible. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these 7 men were about to discover would shatter not just their strategic calculations, but the fundamental assumptions upon which Japan's entire defensive strategy had been built. Their intelligence services had spent 3 years assuring them that American heavy bombers could never reach the home islands from any base the Americans could feasibly capture and hold. Within the next 72 hours, that certainty would collapse, and with it, the psychological foundation of an empire's resistance. The story of how this moment came to be requires us to travel back 18 months to a windowless office in the Nakano district of Tokyo, where a man named Colonel Takushiro Hattori coordinated intelligence assessments for the Army General Staff. Hattori was a meticulous officer, known for his ability to synthesize vast amounts of information into clear, actionable summaries. In May of 1943, he had been tasked with evaluating a disturbing piece of intelligence that had arrived through diplomatic channels in neutral Sweden. The report described an American bomber program of unprecedented scale. The aircraft, designated B-29, was said to be capable of carrying enormous payloads over distances that would have seemed fantastical just 5 years earlier. American engineers, according to the report, had developed pressurized crew compartments, remotely controlled defensive systems, and engines that produced more than 2,000 horsepower each. Hattori assembled a team of technical experts to evaluate these claims. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya of the Naval Air Technical Arsenal, an aeronautical engineer who had studied aircraft design before the conflict began. Okumiya spent 3 weeks analyzing the Swedish report, cross-referencing it with everything Japanese intelligence knew about American aviation capabilities. His conclusion, delivered to Hattori in a 12-page memorandum, was reassuring. The performance characteristics described in the report were theoretically possible, Okumiya acknowledged, but achieving them in a production aircraft would require solving engineering problems that no nation had yet mastered. The pressurization system alone would add tremendous weight and complexity. The engines described would generate so much heat that cooling them at high altitude would be nearly impossible. Most critically, Okumiya calculated that even if the Americans somehow built such an aircraft, its combat radius would be limited to approximately 2,400 kilometers at most. This number became the foundation of Japanese defensive planning. 2,400 kilometers. Draw a circle with that radius around any island the Americans might capture in the Pacific, and Tokyo remained safely outside. The home islands were protected not by fighters or anti-aircraft systems, but by the simple physics of fuel consumption and aerodynamic drag. Hattori presented this analysis to the General Staff in June of 1943. The senior officers received it with visible relief. Japan's defensive perimeter, the ring of island fortresses stretching from the Kuriles through the Marianas to New Guinea, had been designed to make any American advance so costly in men and material that Washington would eventually sue for peace. The knowledge that the home islands remained beyond the reach of strategic bombardment reinforced the logic of this approach. Japan could trade space for time, bleeding the Americans at each island, while the Empire's factories continued producing the weapons needed for the decisive final confrontation. What Hattori and his experts did not know, and could not have known, was that thousands of kilometers away in Wichita, Kansas, a 34-year-old engineer named Edward Wells, was solving the very problems they had deemed unsolvable. Wells led the design team at Boeing that was transforming the B-29 from ambitious concept to flying reality, and he was doing it with a combination of innovative engineering and brute industrial force that Japanese planners simply could not imagine. The pressurization problem, which Okumiya had correctly identified as a critical challenge, Wells addressed by essentially building two aircraft in one. The crew compartments were designed as separate pressure vessels, connected by a tunnel that ran over the bomb bays. This added weight, yes, but American industry could build engines powerful enough to compensate. The Wright R3350 engines that powered the B-29 were indeed prone to overheating, just as Okumiya had predicted. But Wells and his team developed a series of cooling modifications, including redesigned cowl flaps and improved oil coolers, that gradually tamed the temperamental power plants. Most importantly, Wells understood something that his Japanese counterparts did not: the relationship between production scale and engineering refinement. Every B-29 that rolled off the assembly line in Wichita, or in the massive new factory in Marietta, Georgia, or in the converted automobile plants in Renton, Washington, incorporated lessons learned from the aircraft before it. Problems that seemed insurmountable in the prototype stage were solved through iteration, each solution immediately shared across the entire production network. By November of 1943, Boeing was producing B-29s at a rate that would have staggered Japanese industrial planners. The Americans had committed more than $3 billion to the program, an investment larger than the entire annual military budget of most nations. 4 main assembly plants employed over 150,000 workers, operating around the clock in 3 shifts. Subcontractors across the country produced components ranging from propeller blades to gun turrets, all feeding into an industrial network of unprecedented complexity and efficiency. None of this was invisible to Japanese intelligence. They knew the Americans were building the B-29. They knew production was accelerating. What they could not bring themselves to believe was that the aircraft would actually achieve the performance characteristics they had deemed impossible. When reports arrived describing test flights in which B-29s cruised at altitudes above 9,000 meters and speeds exceeding 550 kilometers per hour, Hattori's analysts dismissed them as American propaganda, exaggerations designed to intimidate. This disbelief was not entirely irrational. Japanese engineers had attempted to build their own strategic bombers and encountered exactly the problems they predicted the Americans would face. The Nakajima G-8N Renzan, Japan's closest equivalent to the B-29, remained plagued by engine failures and structural weaknesses despite years of development. If Japanese engineers could not solve these problems with all their skill and dedication, how could the Americans, whom Japanese military culture had long taught them to view as soft, decadent, and lacking in technical sophistication? The answer, of course, was that Japanese engineers were working with a fraction of the resources available to their American counterparts. Japan's entire aircraft industry produced fewer than 30,000 planes in 1944. The United States produced over 96,000. Japan had perhaps 15,000 trained aeronautical engineers. America had over 100,000, plus access to the refugee scientists who had fled Europe, bringing expertise in metallurgy, aerodynamics, and propulsion. But these disparities, though known to Japanese intelligence in general terms, had not been internalized by the men who made strategic decisions. They appeared in reports as abstract numbers, not as the visceral reality of assembly lines stretching for kilometers, of 3 shifts working through the night, of entire cities transformed into aircraft factories. This disconnect between knowledge and understanding would prove fatal. In June of 1944, American forces invaded Saipan. The island, just over 180 square kilometers of volcanic rock and sugarcane fields, had been a Japanese possession since the previous global conflict, and home to over 25,000 Japanese civilians. It was also, as Colonel Hattori immediately recognized, within B-29 range of Tokyo. The realization sent a tremor through the general staff. Suddenly, the comfortable certainties of the 2,400-kilometer calculation came under intense scrutiny. Hattori demanded new assessments from his technical experts. Could the Americans actually operate B-29s from Saipan? What would be the combat radius with a full bomb load? How quickly could they construct the necessary airfields? Lieutenant Commander Okumiya, now assigned to the Naval General Staff, produced a revised analysis. His conclusions, delivered in late June, were more nuanced than his earlier assessment, but still reassuring. Yes, he acknowledged, the B-29's range was greater than initially estimated. Recent intelligence suggested a combat radius of approximately 2,600 kilometers, possibly more with reduced bomb loads. However, Okumiya argued that operating at such extreme ranges would impose severe limitations on American bombing operations. At maximum range, he explained, the B-29s would have almost no fuel reserve for contingencies. Any deviation from the most direct flight path, whether to avoid weather or enemy fighters, would risk running out of fuel over the ocean. The aircraft would be forced to cruise at high altitudes, where bombing accuracy would be poor, and they would have little capacity to maneuver defensively against interceptors. Most importantly, Okumiya calculated that the Americans would only be able to carry perhaps 3,000 kilograms of ordnance per aircraft on missions to Tokyo, a fraction of the B-29's maximum bomb load. Based on this analysis, Okumiya recommended that the home island's defenses focus on high-altitude interception, taking advantage of the B-29's limited maneuverability at extreme range. He estimated that determined fighter opposition could render such long-range raids prohibitively costly, potentially neutralizing the American strategic bombing threat entirely. The General Staff found this assessment plausible. Orders went out to reinforce the home island's fighter defenses and to accelerate production of high-altitude interceptors. The Empire would meet this new threat, as it had met others, with courage, determination, and the superiority of Japanese spirit over American material. Meanwhile, on Saipan, Spies were already at work. The United States Navy's construction battalions, the Spies, represented another aspect of American power that Japanese planners consistently underestimated. These were not ordinary soldiers pressed into construction duty. They were skilled tradesmen, carpenters, electricians, heavy equipment operators and engineers, recruited specifically for their civilian expertise and given military training that turned them into a construction force without parallel in human history. On Saipan, 6 CB battalions, comprising nearly 10,000 men, began work on Isley Field even before the fighting ended. They worked around the clock, sometimes under sporadic fire from Japanese holdouts in the island's caves and jungles. They had bulldozers, graders, rollers, and crushing plants. They had prefabricated steel matting for temporary runways and the equipment to produce crushed coral in quantities measured in hundreds of thousands of cubic meters. Within 2 months, they had built a runway 2,400 meters long and 60 meters wide, capable of handling the heaviest aircraft in the American inventory. Within 3 months, they had extended it to nearly 3,000 meters and begun work on a second parallel runway. Within 4 months, Saipan had hardstands for over 100 B-29s, fuel storage for millions of liters of aviation gasoline, ammunition bunkers, maintenance facilities, and a road network connecting it all. The speed of this construction would have been remarkable enough. What made it extraordinary was that the Spies accomplished it on an island 3,000 kilometers from the nearest major American base, supplied entirely by ship, across a vast ocean that still held the threat of Japanese submarines and aircraft. Every bulldozer, every barrel of asphalt, every crate of tools had to cross that ocean in the holds of cargo vessels. The logistics alone would have daunted most military planners. Japanese intelligence tracked this construction with growing alarm. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the expanding facilities on Saipan, and the images made their way to Hattori's desk in Tokyo. He saw the runways growing, the hardstands multiplying, the fuel tanks appearing. He knew what it meant, but knowing and understanding remained different things. In early November, Hattori received a report from an intelligence officer in the Philippines who had interrogated a captured American airman. The prisoner, a navigator from a B-24 squadron, had spoken freely about scuttlebutt he had heard regarding the B-29 program. According to this man, the new bombers were already on Saipan, and they were preparing for missions against Japan itself. He claimed the B-29s could carry 8,000 kilograms of ordnance to Tokyo, not the 3,000 kilograms that Okumiya had calculated. Hattori dismissed this as either deliberate disinformation or the exaggerations of a low-ranking prisoner trying to inflate his importance. The physics simply did not support such claims. No aircraft could carry that much weight over that distance. The American was either lying or repeating lies he had been told. On November 1st, a single B-29 took off from Saipan. It was not a combat mission, but a reconnaissance flight, the first American aircraft to fly over Tokyo since the Doolittle raid more than 2 years earlier. The aircraft, nicknamed Tokyo Rose by its crew, climbed to over 9,000 meters and crossed the Japanese coastline near Choshi, northeast of the capital. It flew over the city for over an hour, photographing military installations, factories, and port facilities. Japanese radar tracked the aircraft. Fighters scrambled to intercept, but the B-29 cruised at an altitude that the Japanese fighters could barely reach, and at a speed they could not match. One fighter, a Nakajima Ki-44, managed to climb to the bomber's altitude, but could not close the distance before the American aircraft turned for home. The reconnaissance photographs from this flight were on General Curtis LeMay's desk on Saipan within hours. They showed that Tokyo's defenses were weaker than anticipated. The city had few high-altitude fighters and limited radar coverage. The massive industrial complexes that ringed the capital lay sprawled and virtually undefended. LeMay, who had recently taken command of the 21st Bomber Command, began planning the first combat mission. In Tokyo, the overflight caused consternation but not panic. A single reconnaissance aircraft did not constitute a strategic threat. The General Staff noted the flight in their daily intelligence summary and ordered accelerated deployment of radar stations and high-altitude fighters. They remained confident that any actual bombing raids would be small in scale and inaccurate in effect, limited by the constraints of fuel and physics that made long-range bombardment inherently inefficient. On November 24th, 111 B-29s took off from Saipan, bound for Tokyo. The mission targeted the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Factory in Musashino, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the capital that produced a significant portion of Japan's aircraft engines. The B-29s flew in formation at altitudes above 8,000 meters, where Japanese fighters struggled to reach them, and anti-aircraft fire was largely ineffective. The results of this first raid were mixed. High-altitude winds, far stronger than anticipated, scattered the bombs across a wide area. Only about 50 aircraft actually released their ordnance over the primary target, and damage to the Nakajima factory was minimal. One B-29 was lost over the target, and several others went down at sea during the return flight. But the psychological impact of the raid far exceeded its material effect. In the conference room at Imperial General Headquarters, General Umezu and his colleagues studied reconnaissance photographs of their own, images taken by Japanese aircraft showing the B-29 formations over Tokyo. The photographs were grainy and indistinct, but they showed something unmistakable. Not a handful of aircraft at extreme range, struggling to reach the target, but over 100 massive bombers cruising in ordered formation, dropping their payloads and turning for home with an air of almost casual confidence. Colonel Hattori presented a new intelligence assessment that afternoon. His voice was carefully controlled, but his conclusions were stark. The B-29's performance exceeded all previous estimates. Its combat radius was at least 2,800 kilometers, possibly more. Its bomb-carrying capacity on missions to Tokyo was at least 5,000 kilograms, far above Okumiya's calculation of 3,000. And the Americans had over 500 of these aircraft already in the Pacific, with production continuing at a rate of approximately 100 per month. The room was silent as Hattori finished. The implications were clear to every man present. The defensive strategy that had guided Japanese planning for 2 years was based on a fundamental miscalculation. The home islands were not beyond reach. They were exposed, vulnerable, defenseless against a weapon system that Japan had no effective means to counter. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, spoke first. He asked Hattori how this miscalculation had occurred. How had Japanese intelligence failed so completely to assess the B-29's capabilities. Hattori's answer was honest and devastating. They had not failed to gather information, he explained. They had failed to believe it. Every report of the B-29's range and payload had been dismissed as exaggeration because it contradicted what Japanese engineers believed was technically possible. They had measured American capabilities by Japanese limitations and found the Americans wanting. They had been wrong. The conversation that followed was the most painful that many of these officers had ever experienced. They were not discussing a tactical setback or the loss of a single battle. They were confronting the collapse of a worldview, the destruction of assumptions that had shaped every strategic decision for years. If the B-29 could do what it had just demonstrated, then every calculation about the defense of the home islands was wrong. Every assessment of how long Japan could hold out was wrong. Every hope that determined resistance would eventually exhaust American will was wrong. Admiral Sumu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, arrived that evening for an emergency joint conference. The Navy had its own intelligence on the B-29, and it was no more encouraging than the Army's. Toyoda reported that American carrier forces were now operating with almost complete freedom in the Philippine Sea, providing distant cover for the Saipan operations. The Navy had no realistic prospect of interdicting the supply convoys that kept the B-29 bases operational. What this meant, Toyoda explained with brutal directness, was that the Americans could bomb Japan's cities at will for as long as they chose to do so. The Navy could not stop the supply ships, the Army could not stop the bombers. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained to its limits, would be systematically destroyed. The factories producing aircraft, engines, and weapons would be reduced to rubble. The workers would be forced into shelters or dispersed to rural areas. Production would collapse. Kawabe asked the question that was on everyone's mind: what could be done? The answers were not encouraging. Japan could disperse its industries into smaller, harder-to-target facilities. But this would reduce efficiency and production. It could build underground factories. But this would take months and consume resources that were already in short supply. It could focus its remaining fighter strength on intercepting the B-29s, but high-altitude combat was difficult and the bombers were heavily armed. It could develop new weapons like ramming attacks or air-to-air bombing, but these were desperate measures with limited effect. The truth, which no one wanted to say directly, was that there was no effective counter to the B-29. The Americans had achieved a technological and industrial superiority that could not be matched or offset. Japan could resist, could fight, could make the Americans pay for every target they destroyed. But it could not stop them. In the days that followed, the raids continued. Another mission on November 27th, another on December 3rd. The B-29s came in daylight, flying high above the effective ceiling of most Japanese fighters, dropping their bombs through the clouds and the smoke of burning factories. The damage was increasing as American crews gained experience with local conditions and refined their tactics. For Hattori, these days were an exercise in intellectual humiliation. Every report that crossed his desk confirmed how wrong he and his colleagues had been. The B-29s were not struggling at the edge of their range. They were operating with fuel reserves sufficient for extensive diversions and defensive maneuvering. They were not limited to token bomb loads. They were carrying ordnance that increased with each mission, as ground crews on Saipan optimized loading procedures. They were not vulnerable to fighter interception. They were equipped with centralized fire control systems that allowed a single gunner to direct all the defensive weapons on the aircraft, creating overlapping fields of fire that made attacks from any angle dangerous. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with the B-29s reported an aircraft unlike anything they had faced before. It was enormous, with a wingspan of over 43 meters and a length exceeding 30 meters. Its 4 engines, those troublesome Wright R-3350s that Okumiya had predicted would fail under the strain of high-altitude operation, roared with a deep, steady thunder that could be heard for kilometers. Its defensive armament included 12 heavy machine guns in remote-controlled turrets that tracked targets with electric precision. Most disturbing of all, the pilots reported, was the way the B-29s flew. They came in tight formations. maintaining position with an almost mechanical exactness that spoke of excellent training and complete confidence. They held their course through anti-aircraft fire that would have scattered lesser aircraft. When fighters attacked, they responded with coordinated defensive fire while maintaining formation discipline. They behaved, one pilot wrote in his combat report, as if they were in no danger at all. This impression was not entirely accurate. The B-29s faced significant challenges on these early missions. The high-altitude jet stream over Japan scattered bombs far from their intended targets. Mechanical problems, especially with those temperamental engines, forced many aircraft to abort or land short of their bases. Losses, though light by the standards of the air campaign over Germany, were not insignificant, but the Japanese pilots were not wrong about the fundamental reality. The Americans were not afraid. They had built an aircraft that could fly higher and faster than anything Japan could send against it. They had trained crews to operate this complex machine over vast distances with professional competence. They had constructed the logistical infrastructure to base, maintain, and arm it on an island thousands of kilometers from American soil. They had done all this in less than 3 years, from first flight to combat operations. The question that haunted Hattori through the long December nights was not how this had happened. He understood that well enough now. The question was why he and his colleagues had been so certain it could not happen. Why had they looked at the same information available to anyone who read American technical journals and concluded that the B-29 was impossible, while American engineers concluded it was merely difficult? The answer, he came to believe, lay not in technical analysis, but in cultural assumption. Japanese military culture had long taught that American society was soft, decadent, lacking in the spiritual qualities necessary for sustained effort and sacrifice. Americans could produce consumer goods in abundance, yes, but they could not match Japanese dedication and self-discipline. They would not endure the hardships necessary to achieve genuinely difficult objectives. This belief had been comforting. It had allowed Japanese planners to dismiss evidence that contradicted their assumptions. When reports arrived of American workers laboring 12-hour shifts 7 days a week to build B-29s, the reports were filed away as propaganda. When production figures showed American aircraft output exceeding Japanese output by factors of 3 and 4 and 5, the figures were attributed to American exaggeration. When technical assessments indicated that the B-29 would achieve its design specifications, the assessments were dismissed because Japanese engineers had not achieved similar results. The Americans had not been constrained by these assumptions. They had looked at the B-29's requirements and seen a series of engineering problems to be solved, not an impossible vision to be dismissed. They had applied resources, talent, and effort on a scale that Japanese industry could not match. They had accepted that many of their aircraft would be built with flaws that would cause them to crash, and they had built more aircraft to replace them. They had treated failure as data, not disgrace. The result was what Hattori now saw in his reconnaissance photographs, an aircraft that Japanese intelligence had said could not exist, flying missions that Japanese intelligence had said could not be flown, and carrying out a campaign that Japanese intelligence had said could not succeed. By January of 1945, the nature of the B-29 campaign was changing in ways that would make the early raids seem almost gentle by comparison. General LeMay, frustrated by the poor results of high-altitude daylight precision bombing, was experimenting with new tactics. The B-29s would come at night. They would fly at low altitude. They would carry incendiary bombs designed to burn the wooden structures that made up most of Japan's residential and industrial architecture. The first large-scale test of these tactics came on the night of March 9th, when over 300 B-29s dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm destroyed approximately 41 square kilometers of the city and caused casualties on a scale that exceeded any previous aerial bombardment in history. Colonel Hattori was in his office when the raid began. He heard the air raid sirens and went to the window. What he saw over the next several hours was beyond anything he had imagined. The fires spread so fast that they created their own weather, winds that reached hurricane force, and drove the flames through neighborhoods that had stood for centuries. The heat was so intense that canals boiled and glass melted. The smoke was so thick that it could be seen from B-29s 100 kilometers away. The next morning, Hattori walked through the devastated areas. He saw things that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He also saw something that explained, finally, why Japanese intelligence had failed so completely to understand the B-29. Scattered among the ruins were fragments of incendiary bombs, small hexagonal tubes, about 15 centimeters long and 7 centimeters in diameter. Each tube contained napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture that the Americans had developed specifically for this campaign. They were designed to be packed in clusters, hundreds of tubes in each bundle, to be released at low altitude and scatter across a wide area. Hattori picked up one of these tubes and examined it. It was a simple device, almost crude in its construction. There was nothing technologically advanced about it. Any nation with access to petroleum and basic chemicals could produce such a weapon. But scattered around him were thousands upon thousands of these tubes, each one produced in an American factory, loaded into an American aircraft, and dropped over his country. The sheer quantity of them was staggering. The effort required to manufacture them, transport them across an ocean, load them into bombers, and deliver them to their targets was almost incomprehensible. And this was the answer to his question. Japanese intelligence had failed because it had focused on what the Americans were building and not how much of it they could build. The B-29 itself was not an impossible aircraft. It was an ambitious aircraft, a difficult aircraft, an expensive aircraft. But the Americans had not been deterred by ambition, difficulty, or expense. They had simply committed the resources necessary to overcome these obstacles, and they had done so on a scale that Japan could not match. The proof was lying all around him. Thousands of simple incendiary tubes that represented an industrial capacity so vast that it could afford to scatter its products across Japan like leaves in autumn. In the weeks that followed, the B-29 raids continued and intensified. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. One city after another was subjected to the same treatment that had destroyed Tokyo. Japan's industrial capacity was not just degraded, but annihilated. Factories that had produced aircraft, engines, and weapons were burned to their foundations. Workers who had operated the machines were displaced, scattered, or worse. The carefully constructed industrial base that had supported Japanese military power for a decade was being systematically erased. For the men of the Imperial General Headquarters, each raid was a lesson in the consequences of their miscalculation. They had believed the B-29 was impossible, and now it was burning their cities. They had believed American industry was inferior to Japanese spirit, and now American industry was demonstrating its superiority in the most direct way imaginable. They had believed the home islands were beyond reach, and now they were learning that nothing was beyond the reach of an enemy, with the will and resources to extend his grasp. General Umezu, the same officer who had studied that first reconnaissance photograph of Isley Field, convened a meeting of the Supreme War Direction Council in late May. The subject was the strategic situation, but everyone knew what that meant. They were discussing whether and how Japan could continue the conflict. The debate that followed was painful and contentious. Some officers argued that Japan must fight on, regardless of the cost, that honor demanded resistance to the last. Others argued that continued resistance would only bring more destruction, without any prospect of a better outcome. The divisions were deep, and the emotions intense. What was not in dispute was the role that the B-29 had played in bringing them to this point. The aircraft that Japanese intelligence had said could not reach Japan was now the primary instrument of Japan's destruction. The campaign that Japanese intelligence had said could not succeed had already succeeded beyond any rational measure. The assumptions that had guided Japanese planning were not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong, and the consequences were visible in the ruins of every major city in the country. Hattori attended this meeting as an intelligence briefer. When asked to present the current situation, he did so with the clinical precision that had characterized his work throughout his career. He described the number of B-29s now operational in the Marianas, over 800 aircraft. He described the sortie rates, the bomb tonnages, the targets destroyed. He described the American plans, gleaned from signals, intelligence, and prisoner interrogations, to continue and intensify the campaign indefinitely. What he did not describe, because it was not his place to do so, was the lesson he had drawn from these events. The lesson was simple but profound. Intelligence analysis that tells leaders what they want to hear is worse than no analysis at all. The role of intelligence is not to reassure, but to inform, not to confirm assumptions, but to challenge them. An intelligence service that dismisses evidence because it contradicts expectations is not serving its country, but endangering it. These were lessons that Hattori would carry with him through the remaining months of the conflict and into the decades that followed. He would become a historian, writing extensively about the events he had witnessed and the mistakes he had helped make. He would try to ensure that future generations understood not just what had happened, but why it had happened, not just the events, but the thinking that had led to them. The B-29 campaign continued until the very end. The last missions were flown on the day the conflict ended, over 4,000 sorties in the final month alone. By then, Japan's cities were largely in ruins, its industries destroyed, its capacity to resist effectively ended. The aircraft that had accomplished this destruction was never perfect. The B-29 continued to suffer from engine problems throughout its service life. Its losses, though relatively light in percentage terms, included thousands of airmen. Its effectiveness depended entirely on the massive logistical infrastructure that supported it, without which it would have been just another experimental aircraft gathering dust in a hangar. But it flew. That was the point. Japanese intelligence had said the B-29 could not fly missions to Japan, could not carry significant bomb loads at such ranges, could not maintain the sortie rates necessary for a sustained campaign. And in saying these things, they had told their leaders that the home islands were safe, that the strategy of trading space for time would work, that determined resistance would eventually exhaust American will. They were wrong about all of it. They were wrong because they made the mistake that intelligence services must never make. They assumed that what they thought was impossible actually was impossible. They looked at the evidence and saw not what it showed, but what they wanted it to show. They measured American capabilities by Japanese limitations and concluded that the Americans must fail because Japanese engineers had failed. The Americans did not fail. They succeeded so completely that they changed the nature of warfare itself. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan demonstrated that industrial power could be projected across oceans, that the capacity to produce weapons was as important as the skill to use them, that no nation was safe from an enemy with the resources and will to reach it. These were the lessons that Colonel Hattori drew from the B-29 campaign, lessons he would spend the rest of his life trying to convey. The technical details mattered, yes, the ranges and payloads and sortie rates, but what mattered more was the habit of mind that had led Japanese intelligence to dismiss those details when they contradicted comfortable assumptions. The day Japanese High Command realized their spies were wrong about B-29 range was not really a single day. It was a process of gradually escalating shock as each mission demonstrated capabilities that the previous assessment had said were impossible. It was a slow, painful education in the cost of wishful thinking and the danger of underestimating an enemy. Looking back at those reconnaissance photographs of Isley Field, the ones that had first alerted him to the coming storm, Hattori could see now what he had failed to see then. He had looked at the airfield and seen runways and hard stands. He should have looked at it and seen what it represented, the ability of American industry to create from nothing. On a jungle island thousands of kilometers from home, a fully operational strategic bomber base in a matter of months. That ability, not the B-29 itself, was what Japanese intelligence had failed to understand. The aircraft was just a machine. Remarkable, yes, impressive, certainly, but still just a machine subject to all the limitations of machines. What made the B-29 campaign possible was not the aircraft but the system that produced it, maintained it, armed it, and operated it. That system was what Hattori and his colleagues had dismissed as inferior to Japanese spirit. That system was what had burned their cities and ended their hopes, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.